Connected Consumer.
Hi, my name is Rosie Alpino.
And I'm Chris White, and we are the hosts of the Parks Associates podcast, The Connected Consumer.
This podcast is all about Parks Associates data-driven market insights on emerging consumer tech, products and services, featuring our talented analysts and industry leaders who bring new and innovative products to the market.
Throughout this podcast, you'll get an inside look at the latest industry trends focused on connected consumer, home automation, security, energy management, connected health and independent living, and digital content and video services.
In this episode, we'll chat about the latest updates on the MDU smart home market with guest speaker Patrice Samuels, our very own senior research analyst. I want to start off with defining what MDUs is for any of our listeners that may not know. Multi-dwelling units, MDUs, are buildings designed to house several different families or other groups of people contained in a single building or several buildings within one complex. The building is typically divided into separate housing units and is owned by one entity.
So, Ms. Patrice, you have been doing a bunch of research on MDUs, and we wanted to have you on the show because so often we're talking about the connected consumer as if it's a typical kind of freestanding home. You know, the pictures on all the smart home websites are like a little nuclear family in their ultra modern home that's on like a lakefront or something like that. But we know internally that that a lot of smart home buyers are urban, and a lot of them are living in a multi-dwelling unit. So yeah, I guess we should also say that. So we say MDU a lot. But it's really just a multi-family building. It could be a duplex, it could be a high-rise, you know, with tons of different apartments in it. It could be a condo, something like that. So the idea is that it's something just other than a detached single-family home. But those people are still buying smart thermostats and video doorbells and all that. So we have to think about them. So what can you tell us about how they're kind of different than their sort of single-family home, detached home fellow connected consumers?
Sure. So you often hear about, two different terms being used sort of interchangeably, which is, the MDU and then multifamily. So the distinction here is that MDU includes specialty buildings such as your student housing or your senior living facilities, et cetera, while multifamily properties typically refer to your more traditional apartments, if you will. Now, to your point, this is a really important segment, and we see where about 31% of U.S. households live in MDUs, which is a major segment of the U.S. population. Now, the majority of MDUs are occupied by renters, but about 1/3 are occupied by owners. And again, there's often a misconception that MDU renters tend to be, younger consumers. However, what we're finding is that they do vary broadly in age. One of the things we're seeing, though, as we look at age is that, we made the distinction between multifamily owners and renters. And we do see where, owners of multifamily properties tend to be a little bit older, with the large majority being older than 34 years.
Sure, so that makes sense.
As I mentioned, this is generally a very diverse group, and there's a lot of opportunities there to provide robust technical products and services to this market. Now, one area that is increasingly important, of course, is broadband services. Now, we know that many consumers who live in MDUs tend to move around more often, and it is often a real inconvenience to wait to get their broadband services up and running. In fact, in many cases, it can take up to 2 weeks just to get these services up and running after you've moved. Now, we know that consumers now need broadband to, live, work, learn, shop, connect to healthcare, banking, everything, basically, right? And, with the social distancing guidelines during COVID-19, it became abundantly clear that consumers' lifestyles are now more dependent on reliable connectivity and high-speed internet access than ever. At September 2020, we were looking at data that was showing that 59% of workers reported that a household member was working remotely. And 63% of parents who we interviewed reported that they had a child schooling or attending school remotely. So reliable high-speed broadband is really a must-have in this group, and we're seeing where about 40% of MDU renters are interested in both broadband internet from their property manager. And in addition, we're seeing where 77, pardon me, percent of those who are interested are reporting that they're willing to pay higher rental fees to get these services so they can have them up and running quickly.
I would.
Exactly.
You know. Yeah, so I'm on the marketing side of Parks Associates. So I've work a lot with content marketing and outside articles. So I've seen a lot of our research that shows MDU residents are starting to expect, these certain connected products and devices, while others are more like amenities that are attractive to people that are searching for a new apartment or a condo. Could you give us a little bit more detail on consumer wants versus expectations?
Sure. So, well, we did a survey of multifamily property managers in August of this year, and what we found was that 57% of property managers are interested in bulk internet services. And this is in at least one of their properties. So property managers manage multiple properties. So they were referring to putting this or having these implemented in at least one property. Now, bulk internet services, as you just heard me refer to, this is where the property manager sort of enters into an agreement with the internet service provider, where the resident pays the property manager directly for services, and then the property manager in turn pays the internet service provider. Now, what was even more interesting is that 55% of these property managers said that they offer the service because they perceive that it's now an expectation among their residents. So we're now seeing where, given this information, we have several internet service providers that are targeting this MDU segment to offer these bulk internet services. And this includes your traditional internet service providers, such as the AT&Ts and Spectrum, but also there are a number of other smaller internet service providers emerging that are really targeting services to these MDU properties and are really offering some strong competition to these traditional providers. Now, separate from these bulk internet services, Wi-Fi is also being used to attract new MDU residents. And we're seeing where about 69% of property managers who offer Wi-Fi services on their properties report that they do so primarily to attract residents. So there are other reasons, of course, such as, you can drive some, additional higher revenue and that kind of thing. But the majority are saying that they do this so they can attract more customers, basically. Now, 89% of those who do not offer these services report that they plan to do that in the next 12 months. So it's really becoming a very important service in the MDU space.
Yeah.
Now, also for those who have not implemented Wi-Fi services at all within their properties, high deployment cost is often one reason given for not implementing the services, and also technical problems can also be a leading reason. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing where about a third of the property managers who have already implemented these services report that they've had difficulties, such as maintaining connectivity, and also just managing resident credentials can also be a challenge, just managing those credentials that they use to sign on to the service. So in order for these arrangements to really work and to be mutually beneficial to both, to property managers, residents, internet service providers, everyone, it's important that the internet service providers sort of manage property Wi-Fi networks and in ways that promote good experiences all around. Now, beyond the Wi-Fi, there's also the expanded use of technologies in and around MDU properties, and that's sort of evident in residents' use of connected devices. Now, the adoption of smart home devices like thermostats, video doorbells, smart lights, and smart door locks among MDU residents has grown significantly since 2018. In fact, when we did some research in 2020, we were finding that MDU resident adoption of smart home devices significantly surpassed adoption among residents in your more traditional single-family home. We were finding that 41% of MDU broadband households report owning at least one smart home device, and that compared to 34% of those living in single-family homes.
So that's really interesting, Patrice. So obviously, when you're buying all these devices and bringing them in to your home, you kind of, when you live in a single family home that you own and all that, you have the freedom to do whatever you need to do to install it. Like, what are the different approaches people are taking, and kind of like, what are the issues surrounding people showing up with bringing their own devices versus using the ones that the property manager is providing?
There are different permissions that are allowed. Some properties don't even allow their residents to install a lot of these devices. A lot of devices, there's some additional wiring that needs to take place and stuff like that.
Right.
So, property managers are just not wanting to have a lot of, residents, boring holes and doing additional wiring in their properties. That's just not something that, is really good in general for the property, that, there's a lot of turnover and new residents coming and going at different times.
But it is fair to say, though, that some residents are still bringing in their own devices and kind of using them in the home in ways that are not like a permanent change, and then bringing them with them when they leave. That's still true?
There are some devices, and I know we don't at Parks consider or classify smart speakers, for example, as a typical smart home device, but I would imagine if residents do purchase a device like a smart speaker, then they would take it with them when they're leaving. Thermostats are more complex, but we haven't had research yet to show whether or not residents are, who have implemented a thermostat, which I'm sure, many don't have permission to do that, whether or not they would be taking them with them after they've left the property or not.
Right. Now that the interesting part, something that really strikes me coming out of all this is that, again, we're thinking of the family a lot of times as the customer. And while they are the consumer, kind of in air quotes, because they're the end user in kind of the MDU space, it's the property manager who are actually making the buys and, spending the money, choosing the brands that they choose, dealing with the services like you talked about, troubleshooting and things like that with broadband. How, since we did this study that you worked on with the property managers actually giving the feedback, can you talk to us a bit about what their property managers are saying, their experiences with the smart home devices?
Sure. I mean, property managers are embracing smart home devices as far as I can see. We have 95% of property managers now who we surveyed report that they think that smart home devices can really significantly increase rental fees, and the majority of them give values of between 5 and 30% that they can see in terms of these additional rental fees. So, the additional revenues that can drive is just one of the important factors to them. When we ask about the different benefits, such as reducing operating costs, increasing rental values, we just find that increase in rent is very important. And the numbers that they're giving for the increases are significantly high as well. Now, among those who currently use their devices on the property, we're also finding that they're satisfied with the devices. So more than 90% are satisfied with the reliability of the devices, and we're finding a high percentage too are saying that they're finding the devices are easy to use, which is a major plus right there. Now, those who do not currently use the devices tend to expect lower rental increases. That's kind of what we're seeing. The numbers are fairly close, but we're finding that those who are actually using the devices are actually reporting that higher increases or higher benefits than those who are not reporting devices. And those who are not reporting devices are really reporting on what they expect the benefits to be. Now, the property managers who are using devices are also more likely to think that the devices are providing better experiences. So when we ask those who are not using the devices, what they think about them, they generally tend to think that the devices will be more problematic as well. So what do property managers want when investing in these devices? We're finding that the use cases around preventing theft and burglary are the ones that they're finding most appealing. A relatively high percentage also find the ability to monitor HVAC systems to prevent sort of major emergencies. That use case is very appealing because, repairing those systems can be very costly to an apartment. So they're saving money there. And then managing the use of lights is surprisingly one of those features that, they're finding interesting, or one of the use cases that they find appealing. I guess it's really difficult to, go around to each property and manually turn lights off. So, just being able to remotely control that is something that is appealing. Now, These use cases are really driving the expansion of smart home device adoption among this group. So from a recent survey, we find that, among those who do not have smart home devices already, we find that 84% of those property managers intend to install connected devices in at least one of their properties in the next 12 months. And among this group as well, they're very optimistic. 87% expect to achieve some kind of return on their smart home device investment in 2 or 3 months. And actually, that's actually pretty realistic when we look at the numbers that are coming out in terms of the additional rent that they're able to charge per month, and how much they pay for the initial upfront costs for these devices. They can make that revenue back in months based on some of the numbers that I'm seeing. Now, property managers also are aware that they have a lot of options when it comes to the vendor that they choose to adopt and install these smart home devices. So we're finding that the vendor selection is important, and it's going to be a major differentiator going forward, just by the kinds of devices that they offer and their ability to integrate their systems into sort of the back-end management systems of these property manager buildings. The vendors that are in the space is an increasingly competitive space, and they really must sort of have regular dialogue with these property managers to find out what's important to them.
Right.
Get ahead of it, just be proactive. And I can tell you that forming these sort of proactive integrations with the systems that the majority of property managers are already using is probably going to be a real differentiator going forward, because it will allow these properties to onboard more seamlessly per se, or invest in these products efficiently is probably the best way to put it there.
Right. Great insights. So we're getting close to the end of this episode. I know there's so much more to talk about, but we'll save it for another one. So give us any sneak peeks on, what's coming soon on, MDU research or anything smart home related.
So as you know, a lot of this research that I talked about, a lot of the data points that I gave in this episode is really looking at the property manager view of the smart home, which is what we've been studying in detail so far this year. But we do have additional research coming out that's going to give some insight on the consumer side of things. So it's going to be really interesting to compare. We look at use cases that property managers find interesting, and we're seeing that, being able to manage the lights and being able to, manage the HVAC systems and property security are some of the things that really stood out when looking at the property manager side of things. So we're doing the same thing on the consumer side. We want to examine the use cases that they're finding interesting, and it would be really interesting to see if the needs are the same. Ultimately, any vendor who is trying to provide services to this space is going to be very important. Even though the property manager is the buyer, ultimately the property manager wants to satisfy their resident. So it's going to be important to understand both sides of the equation and build solutions that will really meet the needs of everyone involved. And it's sort of mutually beneficial. We've come back to that word that I mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. So Patrice, also in there, plug yourself. How can people get in touch with you if they want to ask you more questions and talk to you more about these topics?
Sure. So reach out to me at Parks Associates. Reach out to me by email, patrice.samuels@parksassociates.com. I'm also Patrice at Parks on Twitter. I think those might be the most efficient ways to get through to me, but I think those are good ways.
Hey, connected consumers, thanks for tuning in today. Please make sure to look out for our next episode where we're going to cover more about privacy and security, connected health, and so much more.
And as always, we want your feedback. So please feel free to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet at us. Chris, what's your Twitter?
I'm C White Insights.
C White Insights. And I just changed mine recently because it's so much easier to pronounce. So you can just tweet at me at Rosie Olpino, or you can tweet at Parks Associates to let us know what you think and what you'd like to hear next.